means that it's distilled from fermented grains. Bourbon means that the recipe of those grains contains a majority corn. Bourbon is a type of corn whiskey. If it's not at least 51% corn in the recipe, it's not bourbon, it's some other type of whiskey. Now, we used to have a display that I got to point at to talk about all of our different mash bills, but they painted over it after the flood, so it's going to be a little bit abstract while I kind of talk about the different recipes that we use. But we have about 4 different whiskey mash bills that we use all the time. Mash bill number 1 is a low rye bourbon mash bill. That means that it's majority corn to make it a bourbon. We add malted barley to help with the mashing and fermentation process, and we use rye as a secondary flavor grain. Rye tends to add some spice, give it a note, some heat, some kick, but that mash bill number 1, as I mentioned, is a low rye. So there's a whole lot of corn, just a little bit of rye, which may make those products sweeter than some other bourbons you may have had somewhere else. Mash bill number 1 is going to be products like Benchmark, Buffalo Trace, Eagle Rare. Those are all considered mash bill number 1 products. Mash bill number 2 is another bourbon mash bill. It is an older mash bill for us. There is a little less corn, a little more rye, which may make mash bill number 2 legally distinct from mash bill number 1. Mash bill number 2 typically becomes Blanton's Ancient Age, Elmer T. Lee. Those are all considered mash bill number 2 products. Then the third bourbon mash bill we use all the time is our Weller mash. And instead of using rye as a secondary flavor grain, take all that rye out and they put wheat in instead. Wheat makes the product a little softer, possibly a little sweeter as well. The Weller mash, of course, becomes all the Weller bourbons, but it also becomes all of the Van Winkle bourbons as well. And then the fourth whiskey mash bill we use all the time is not a bourbon mash bill at all. It's actually our rye whiskey mash bill. So instead of being majority corn in the recipe to make it a bourbon, we use majority rye to make it a rye whiskey. Now, we do typically use corn as a secondary flavor grain for most of our rye whiskeys, which may make ours a little sweeter than some others you may have had somewhere else. Now, as I mentioned, I used to have a display to make that make a lot more sense. But does anyone, did that still track at all? That makes sense for everybody? Okay. Yeah. Any questions about our mash bills at all before we start talking about something else? Okay, then we'll go ahead and start to talk a little bit about our history. So our history as a licensed distillery starts around 1870 or so. One of the first licensed distilleries built on site was built around that time by E.H. Taylor Jr. Now, E.H. Taylor Jr. had studied abroad in Europe. He saw some of the new technology they were using as part of the Industrial Revolution, as well as a lot of the old traditions they were still keeping alive, and he wanted to bring all that back here to shake up the American whiskey industry. One thing that he saw while he was over there is that they always use copper in their stills. And copper acts as a filter that pulls sulfides out that the yeast makes. If you leave the sulfides in, they make the whiskey smell like dirty cabbage whiskeys. Oh, it can go in its own, but the copper just pulls it right out. So Taylor thought, well, if a little bit of copper is nice, a lot of copper's got to be really nice, so he made sure copper touched every step of the process. He had the fermenting vats lined with copper. He had a state-of-the-art column still built entirely out of copper, and he had copper pipes used to move everything around. So we called this distillery OFC, or Old Fired Copper, to let people know they were getting a quality copper-touch product reminiscent of those old European distilleries. At the time, copper was incredibly expensive to import, and there weren't a whole lot of copper mines in the United States. So Taylor took out a lot of money for all that copper. He also wanted all these new buildings he was building to look nice as well, so he took out a lot of money for all this new stuff. And like a lot of people who take out a lot of money to start a very nice business, a recession hit immediately after, and Taylor couldn't pay back any of his loans. He ended up having to sell his debts and this distillery to a man named George T. Stagg. Now, George T. Stagg was living as a liquor wholesaler out of St. Louis, Missouri, but he was originally from here in Kentucky. So he moved back to help run the business with E.H. Taylor. Problem was, E.H. Taylor, George T. Stagg, they had very different business philosophies. Taylor wanted to make quality whiskey at the cost of anything. Stagg, he wanted to make good whiskey, of course, but he also wanted to make money at some point. So they butted heads quite a bit, and eventually, after about 6 years or so of working together, Taylor left this distillery, went down the road, founded the Old Taylor Distillery that you would now know as Castle and Key. But we kept distilling here, and in the mid to late 1890s, a young boy was hired here. His name was Albert Blanton. He was just 16 years old when he got his first job here. He was an office boy running papers around, but he ended up doing every job on this distillery site until, in his late 30s, in 1921, he became the president of our distillery. Now, I don't know about you all, but I want to be the president of the distillery in 1921, because that was just at the beginning of Prohibition here in America. But what Bland was able to do is he was able to get us a medicinal whiskey license through the Shinley Corporation, so we were able to continue to bottle, distribute, and sell whiskey for medicinal purposes only. Now, after Prohibition ended, whiskey rode counter again, and demand skyrocketed. In the following 20-ish years, while Albert Blanton was still president here, we went from a 14-building operation to a 114-building operation. That's really where most of this distillery, as you know it today, was built up. It's also most of the reason why we're a National Historic Landmark. We have architecture, construction styles from the early 30s, 40s, and 50s, all kept here in good condition. Now, we've kept all these buildings in good condition because we're still using them. Albert Blanton had the biggest, best stuff built. We still use all that stuff to this day. One of the buildings on the backside of our visitor center is our old fermenter building. Albert Blanton had 12 92,000-gallon fermenters. So big, if you laid them on their side, you could drive a cart. We still use all those fermenters to this day. If you look over this way, you'll see there's some tall brick buildings over there. The one with the older looking brick to the right is the old still house. That houses a 40-foot tall, 7-foot diameter column still, one of the largest column stills in the industry. Albert Blanton had that built. We still use that to this day. Well, now of course, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. From the 1960s to the 1990s, there was a large decline in American whiskey. Simply wasn't hip, it wasn't cool to drink. It's hip and cool to drink beer, wine, wine coolers, stuff like that. If you were drinking hard spirits, you may have been drinking rum or tequila, possibly a vodka or gin cocktail, and the bourbon industry suffered quite a bit. We, from about 1,000 people working here at our peak before the Second World War, to around 40 people working here at our absolute lowest in the early 90s. It was a pretty rough time. A lot of places shut their doors. But through the leadership of our master distiller at the time, Elmer T. Lee, we were able to keep distilling until this current bourbon boom we're having right now. Speaking of, some of you may have noticed that it's kind of hard to find our product anymore. We're working on it. Near the tail end of a $1.2 billion expansion just to try and meet demand. We've more than doubled our fermentation capacity, built 20 more fermenters, some of them even larger than the ones Albert Blanton built. But the first 12 in the building right next to the old one, problem was that second building, only 2 stories tall. We had to lift the roof up off that building 9 feet to fit those new fermenters in. That new tall brick building over there, that's that new still house, houses an exact replica of that 7-foot diameter column still, down every nut and bolt, every dent and ding. That went online about 2.5 years ago now. We've also built new aging warehouses. Up on the hill, you may have seen some big red buildings as you were driving in. Those are our new aging warehouses. They reach the length of a football field 7 floors high to hold over 58,000 barrels apiece. Got 19 built up on the hill right now. With that, we've tripled our aging warehouse capacity, but we still have plans to finish building about 20 more farther off the site as well. With that, we'll have more than quintuple our aging warehouse capacity.
Yeah.
And all that means to say is that we're working. Problem is, good whiskey takes time. Buffalo Trace, for example, ages for about 7 to 8 years. So while we're waiting for Mother Nature to kick those barrels around a little bit, all that we ask is that you all please be patient. Now, anyone have any questions about our history or anything we've talked about so far?
How many employees do you have now?
How many employees do we have now? Over 850. Now that may include, yeah, not quite, but we make a lot more whiskey than we did back then, with much more automated bottling lines and things like that. But the 850 number, that may include people that work in the Sazerac offices that are now in Louisville. It does include over 170 people that just work in the visitor center. Factory side, 100-ish, I'm not really for sure. So yeah.
How many unique brands, and then within those brands, how many different?
I want to say from those 4 mash bills that we mentioned before, the number I've been told we have about 18 different brands and expressions of those brands. I have no idea. It's a lot. Because at least under Taylor, there's 18 different expressions alone. But a lot of those are kind of one-off that they're probably never going to really do again, or certainly not at a large scale. It seemed like for a period, if we had a pretty successful experiment where we would age it in our older warehouses, they would release it under the Taylor product. And now they're kind of doing different stuff with that. For example, there were some weeded Taylor products that they'll probably only release under Weller now. I'm not in charge of that, but a lot. If you just go to our website and look at all of our products and brands, it's a really good list of everything we make, and then admit to making. So yeah. Any other questions before we start moving? All right, well, we're gonna head up the portrait this way.